I shot one of my own allies on purpose. And I was ready for the courts-martial. But if I could go back to that moment, the bullet wouldn't have gone into his leg. Not a chance. For 50 years, I've carried that moment with me, a ghost in my own mind. Most days I can shove it down, bury it under a mountain of mundane stuff, groceries, grandkids, the price of gas. But some nights, it comes back clearer than a photograph, and I can hear the jungle and the screams all over again. I'm telling you this now because I have to. The truth of it, the weight of it, has just gotten too heavy to carry alone. It's not a story for a book or a movie, it's just the truth of what a boy from Ohio saw and did, and what a man has to live with. When I signed up, I was just a kid. I was 19. All I knew about war came from the movies and the old men in town who had fought in Europe or the Pacific. They talked about honor, about duty, about fighting for a cause. That's what I believed. I believed we were there for a noble reason, to stop the spread of communism and to help a people who couldn't help themselves. It was black and white in my mind. You were either on our side or you were the enemy, and we were the good guys. I was clean-cut, full of patriotic fire, and ready to go save the world. You know, you go over there thinking you're this great liberator. You don't know the dark things that wait for you. War, it has a way of taking everything from you, even the cleanliness of your soul. I didn't know then that my real war wouldn't be with the Viet Cong, but with what I was about to witness. The battlefield wasn't just a place of bullets and bombs, it was a place where your own moral code could get torn apart, a piece at a time, until you didn't even recognize yourself anymore. I remember stepping off that plane, the heat hitting me like a fist. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and something else I couldn't place. Something ancient and dangerous. I was confident, cocky even. I had my rifle, my training, and my belief in the rightness of our mission. I didn't know that the biggest threat to my soul wouldn't be the guys in the black pajamas, but the guys wearing a uniform just like mine. I had no idea that a single moment of moral clarity, of doing the one right thing, would become the one thing that still haunts me to this day. It's funny how that works. You do something you think is right and it just breaks you anyway. This is not a hero's story. It's a story about a moral line that got crossed, not by me but by someone I was supposed to trust. And it's a story about the single act I took to try and put that line back in its place, even if it meant getting myself killed or locked up. I just needed to stop it. I had to. And I did. I had to. It was the only choice I had. The first thing I remember is the heat. It wasn't just hot, it was a physical weight, like a wet blanket being thrown over your entire body the second you stepped off the C-130. I flew in from Okinawa and I had been briefed on what to expect, but no amount of training or briefing can prepare you for that. The air wasn't just humid, it was thick, soupy, filled with 100 different smells all at once. There was the smell of diesel fuel from the transport trucks, mixed with something sweet and rotting, like overripe fruit left in the sun for too long. And underneath it all, a faint metallic smell that I'd later learn was the scent of war, blood and sweat and fear. I had this image in my head from the movies, you know? Of a clean, organized base of soldiers standing at attention. The reality was pure chaos. We landed at Bien Hoa Air Base and it was a madhouse. Helicopters were lifting off and landing constantly, their rotor blades kicking up dust and dirt in massive, blinding clouds. Guys were running everywhere, some with purpose, some just looking lost. You had trucks filled with crates, jeeps with no doors, and a million different noises all competing for your attention. The Vietnamese people on the base, cooks, laundry workers, locals, they moved with a kind of quiet resilience that was almost unnerving. They'd seen it all before. We were the new ones, the greenhorns. That first week was a blur. My platoon was assigned to a perimeter patrol unit, and we were immediately thrown into the rhythm of the jungle. It wasn't the heroic, stand-and-fight kind of combat you see in the movies. It was patient, methodical, and filled with a constant, low-level dread. You were always listening, always watching, always waiting for a tripwire or a shadow that didn't belong. The jungle was a living thing and it didn't care about us. The bugs, the rain, the thick foliage that hid everything, it all felt like the enemy. You'd be walking drenched in sweat with a 50-pound pack on your back and you'd think, this is it. This is what I was trained for. But it wasn't. The training was for a different kind of war. This was a war of endurance, of paranoia, of not knowing who or what was out there. We quickly learned that the real fight wasn't just against the enemy you could see. It was against the environment, against the sicknesses that took guys down, and against the crushing weight of knowing you were a long way from home. That feeling of being a million miles away, of being an alien in a land that wanted nothing to do with you, it hit me hard. You'd look at the villagers and wonder what they thought of you. You'd see their faces, old and young, and you'd try to find some sign of a shared humanity, some reason for why we were all here. But there was a gap between us that felt as wide as the ocean I had just flown over. It was in this chaotic, disorienting new world that I first saw them, the South Koreans. They were a different breed altogether. They didn't laugh much. They didn't joke around. They moved with a purpose and an efficiency that was both incredible to watch and deeply unsettling. I thought I had come prepared for a new kind of war, but I was wrong. I was about to find out there were rules I never even knew existed, and some of our own allies were playing by a different book entirely. I didn't meet them right away, but you didn't have to be close to see them. You just had to be on the same base. You'd be walking to the mess hall or back to your barracks, and you'd see a company of ROK troops moving in formation. The GIs would stop talking, even the loud ones. They were a different kind of quiet. Not the easy, relaxed quiet of men resting, but a focused, intense stillness, like a coiled spring. There were no jokes, no slouching, no complaining. Their uniforms were always immaculate, even in the jungle heat. Their gear was arranged perfectly. They looked like they were carved out of stone, with a sharp, disciplined look in their eyes. They moved like tigers, silent and deadly. You couldn't help but be impressed. They weren't just soldiers, they were predators. Our patrols were methodical, following maps and orders. Theirs seemed more intuitive, like they smelled the enemy in the air. We heard stories from guys who had worked with them in the field. Stories about their speed, their ferocity. They didn't just engage the enemy, they hunted them down. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. It was pure raw combat. We called them the ghost tigers because you never saw them coming, but you knew they were there. Their reputation preceded them. They were the ones you wanted on your side, the ones who would get the job done no matter what. We had our own brand of toughness, sure, but theirs was on a different level. Our toughness was about survival, about getting through the day. Theirs was about absolute dominance. We fought for our country, they fought for something else. Back then, I thought it was just a deeper form of patriotism, maybe forged in their own war against the North. We saw their scars, both the physical ones and the kind you saw in their cold, hard stares, and we assumed it was the price they paid for their effectiveness. It was an unspoken admiration. You didn't talk about it, but you knew every guy on the base was thinking the same thing. Damn, those guys are tough. They seemed to understand the jungle in a way we never could. They were comfortable in it, a part of it. We were always outsiders, fighting against the elements as much as the enemy. But they were born to it. Or at least they had been forged by it. We'd see them come back from a mission, not a single drop of sweat showing on their brows, their faces impassive. They just returned to their barracks, clean their weapons and wait. There was a sense of finality to their work. When they came back, you knew the job was done. It was brutal, efficient, and in a strange way beautiful to witness. We didn't know the full story. We didn't know how deep the scars went, or what exactly they were willing to do to get the job done. We just saw the surface, the machine-like discipline and the quiet, deadly confidence. And in a war as messy as Vietnam, that was a kind of strength you couldn't help but respect. It was the kind of strength we all wished we had a little more of. It was only later that I learned the true cost of that strength. A cost that went far beyond what anyone ever told us. Their toughness, that chilling, machine-like efficiency, it wasn't something we feared. It was something we respected. We admired them. We thought their coldness was strength. We were wrong, but we didn't know it yet. We just knew we had a lot to learn from them, especially when it came to surviving in this unforgiving jungle. We saw them operate on patrol, and it was a different kind of war than what we were used to. We'd go out, set up ambushes, try to get a clear shot. They'd just disappear into the foliage, and you'd hear a commotion a few minutes later. They were relentless. They never stopped. We believed they were the warriors we needed, the ones who understood the brutal rules of this jungle. The ones who could get down and dirty in a way we weren't prepared for. We had our technology, our air support, our heavy artillery. They had an almost primal understanding of the ground war. They didn't rely on gadgets. They relied on instinct and raw grit. There was a quiet communication between them, just a look or a hand gesture, and they knew exactly what to do. You'd see them sharing a sea ration, not talking much, but there was a bond there that was forged in a different kind of fire. Their coldness back then, I thought that was strength. It was the lack of emotion, the lack of hesitation, that we all secretly envied. It was a shield. In a place where a moment of fear could get you killed, they seemed to feel nothing. They just moved forward. And we, the GIs, the kids from small towns and big cities, we'd watch them and feel a sense of security we hadn't felt before. With them around, you felt like you had a true partner in the fight. They didn't just hold a line, they took ground. They didn't just repel an attack, they went hunting for the source of it. That admiration, it grew every single day. We'd trade stories, not that they were talkative. We'd hear about their relentless interrogations, their refusal to take prisoners if it slowed them down. We'd hear about their legendary kill counts. They were a different kind of soldier, and in a war that felt so ambiguous and confusing to us, their clear-cut, single-minded mission was almost comforting. They were the tip of the spear, and we felt safer just being in their shadow. We thought we understood them. We thought they were just a more disciplined, more ferocious version of ourselves. They seemed to share our goals: win the war and get out. I would have trusted them with my life. We all did. They were the silent partners we needed to get the job done. I saw them as hardened professionals, forged by their own war in Korea. I respected them. And that respect made what came later all the more shocking. It's funny how that works, isn't it? You build someone up in your mind, you give them all the qualities you admire, and then a single moment of ugly truth can tear it all down. That's the part they don't show you in the movies. The part where your faith in a fellow soldier, in an ally, shatters into a million pieces. That respect I had for them, that silent admiration for their toughness, it was a foundation built on sand. The first cracks started to show slowly, almost imperceptibly, just little things that didn't sit right with my gut. We'd be on a joint patrol, and we'd come across a small village, a handful of bamboo huts and a few families just trying to get by. My platoon would follow procedure. We'd clear the area, check for tunnels, try to communicate with the villagers, mostly through gestures and the few phrases we knew. But the ROK troops, they were different. There was no attempt at communication, no respect for personal space. It was all business, cold and without a trace of humanity. I remember one time, a kid started crying when one of their soldiers just grabbed his mother's arm to move her out of the way. The ROK soldier didn't even flinch. He just looked at the kid with a blank stare, like he was looking at an obstacle, not a person. It was a strange feeling, that initial unease. We'd look at each other, us GIs, and there would be that unspoken question in our eyes. Did you see that? We try to brush it off. They're just more efficient, we tell ourselves. They don't have time for a kid's feelings. It's war. It was a simple, easy excuse. But the feeling of something being wrong would stick to you like the humid air, a little whisper in the back of your mind. You'd see a small sack of rice being kicked over, a family's meager belongings tossed aside in a search for weapons. These weren't war crimes, not by the book, but they were small acts of cruelty that felt wrong. They were small enough to ignore but big enough to leave a mark. I remember another time, a young farmer was being interrogated about a rumored Viet Cong presence. Our guys would usually have a translator, try to get information, maybe offer a cigarette. But the ROK troops had a different method. No translator. No cigarettes. Just a cold, hard stare and a series of sharp jabs with the butt of a rifle. The farmer would yelp in pain, but he wouldn't talk. They seemed to get a strange satisfaction from it, a cold, detached sense of power. They weren't looking for information, they were looking to dominate. It felt less like an interrogation and more like a cruel show of force. My platoon sergeant, a grizzled old-timer named Miller, just looked away. When I asked him about it later, he just said, "Son, they do things their way. We do things ours. Just keep your head down and do your job." His silence, that easy dismissal, it felt like a silent endorsement. Our silence then, it was like a complicity. We weren't doing the deeds, but we weren't stopping them either. We were standing by, watching, telling ourselves it wasn't our problem. I started to notice that their eyes weren't just disciplined. There was an emptiness there, a lack of connection to the world around them. It was as if their own humanity had been carved out, leaving behind only the machine of a soldier. Their reputation for being relentless and effective came at a price that went far beyond mere courage. It was a price of soul. I began to realize that their coldness wasn't strength, it was an absence of feeling. And in a war that demanded you be human, even in the midst of inhumanity, that was the most terrifying thing of all. I would try to talk about it with my guys, but nobody wanted to get into it. It was a subject you just didn't touch. The unspoken rule was clear: don't ask, don't tell. We needed them, or at least that's what we were told. Their impressive kill counts and their reputation made them valuable assets. So we looked the other way. We pretended not to see the villagers flinch when they approached. We pretended not to hear the quiet whimpers from behind closed doors. We convinced ourselves it was a necessary evil. But every time we turned away, another crack appeared in my belief system. The black and white world I had enlisted in was starting to blur, turning into a muddy, confusing gray. I began to ask myself, what was the real difference between us and them? We were all soldiers, all on the same side, fighting for the same cause, weren't we? But a doubt, a tiny seed of doubt, had been planted in my mind. It was a doubt that would grow into a dark certainty, an idea that would force me to question everything I had ever believed about myself, about my country, and about the very nature of war. I had no idea then that it was just the beginning. That creeping doubt turned into a gnawing certainty with every new thing I saw. It wasn't just the small acts of cruelty anymore. It was a pattern, a cold, calculated efficiency that went beyond what any of us were trained for. I remember one patrol where we were moving through a village that had been flagged for suspected Viet Cong activity. Our unit was methodical, searching every hut. The ROK soldiers, they were faster. We heard a commotion behind a thatched wall, and when we got there, we found them with a young man, a boy really maybe 15 years old. He had a small wound on his leg, probably from stepping on a punji stick, but nothing serious. They had him pinned to the ground and were just looking at him. No words. No shouting. Just that same cold, empty stare. I felt this rush of adrenaline. I wanted to yell, to tell them to stop. But what could I say? They weren't my men. I had no authority. All I could do was stand there, my rifle hanging uselessly in my hands, a silent observer to a quiet, terrifying threat. It was in those moments that I started to truly understand something was fundamentally broken. We, the American GIs, we had this set of rules, this Geneva Convention, this idea of what was right and wrong. We had a line even if we were pushed to cross it. But they had no line. Their actions seemed to be governed by a different set of rules entirely. It was a strange disconnect, like we were playing two different games on the same field. They'd go out on their own ops, come back with a body count that seemed impossibly high. And you'd hear the rumors. The whispers in the mess hall after a few beers. The little snippets of conversation between officers. That's where the truth, or at least my version of the truth, started to come out. I'd overhear officers talking about the ROK divisions, not in terms of strategy or brotherhood, but in terms of money. They'd mention the aid packages and the subsidies. They were talking about them like a hired gun. I heard a major say to a captain one night, Look, they're not here for a parade. They're getting paid a fortune to be here. We're paying them to be this effective. Don't ask questions, don't get in their way, and let them do what they do best. The words hit me like a kick to the gut. It suddenly made sense. All of it. The brutality, the lack of humanity, the sheer ruthless efficiency. They weren't our allies in a noble fight. They were mercenaries. They were here for the paycheck, not for freedom or democracy. It was a trade, their lives for our money. And the collateral damage, the civilians, the innocent people caught in the crossfire, that was just a part of the deal. That thought, it broke something inside me. It shattered the last piece of the illusion I had clung to. I started to question everything. What was I here for? Was I just a part of this dirty business? A soldier in an army full of hired guns? It was a dirty war. But I was starting to realize that not everyone was fighting for a noble cause. I thought I was. But I was standing next to a force that was purely transactional. Their brutality wasn't born of a righteous anger against the enemy, it was a professional skill honed for profit. Our silence then, it was like a complicity. I wasn't pulling the trigger, but by being there, by not speaking up, I was part of the machine. I was a bystander to the very evil I thought I was fighting. I'd look at my own reflection and feel a sense of shame. I had been a part of this. And that realization, that my own innocence had been stained by simply being a witness, was a moral injury more painful than any physical wound. The line had been crossed not just by them but by me. I was a part of it. I found myself asking, was I a mercenary too? Just one who hadn't gotten his paycheck yet? I began to feel like the entire mission was a lie. The noble cause was a lie. The brotherhood was a lie. The whole war was a lie. And it was all a lie built on the bodies of innocent people. And in the middle of it all were us, the good guys, standing shoulder to shoulder with killers who did what they did because we paid them to. That shame I felt, that sense of complicity, it festered. It became a constant, low-level hum of dread in my head. My black and white world had dissolved into 1,000 shades of gray, and I was drowning in it. The last piece of my illusion finally shattered on a day that seemed like any other. We were on patrol near a small stream, and a handful of ROK soldiers were with us. We came across a small village of maybe 10 huts. Empty. The villagers had fled. But the ROK troops didn't just clear it and move on. They started a methodical, chilling process of destruction. They went into each hut and systematically broke apart the ceramic pots, the clay stoves, the family heirlooms. A small boy's toy, a little wooden elephant, was tossed into a fire. It was a senseless act. It served no military purpose. There were no weapons, no tunnels. This wasn't about security, it was about cruelty. It was about making a statement, about demonstrating power. They were destroying a family's history, their meager possessions, for no other reason than they could. My guts twisted. I looked at their impassive faces and I saw something worse than anger or hatred. I saw a chilling void. It was an absence of emotion, a cold, empty professionalism. They were so good at what they did, so efficient, that the humanity had been completely scrubbed from them. They had become something else entirely. I wondered, were we all mercenaries just with different price tags? They got paid a fortune to be here and we were just soldiers doing our duty. But what was the real difference if the result was the same? The destruction, the fear, the shattered lives. I started to see the whole operation through a different lens. Not as a noble fight for freedom, but as a dirty business transaction. A war for profit. A trade of lives for dollars. And I was just a cog in that machine. The things they did, they weren't just about winning the war. They were about making a profit, about sending a message of fear, about showing how little they cared for human life when it wasn't their own. And we, the Americans, with our good intentions and our idealistic reasons, we were just enabling them. We were the bankers for their brand of brutality. And my silence, my looking away, it felt like I was signing off on every act of cruelty. I felt a sense of disgust so deep it made me want to throw up. Disgust for the war, for the guys I was serving with, and most of all, for myself. My own honor, my own belief in what was right, it was getting chipped away one small horrible act at a time. The simple black and white of my youth was replaced with a muddy, confusing gray, a world where the lines between good and evil were so blurred you couldn't tell them apart. I was becoming something I never wanted to be. A bystander. A co-conspirator. I wasn't just losing my innocence. I was losing my soul. And I didn't even know if I could get it back. I had no idea then that a single, terrible act would finally force me to make a stand. That all of this, all the quiet fear and the building shame, was just a prelude. A dark and awful warm-up for a moment that would define the rest of my life. A moment that would finally force me to cross a line of my own. Not for an order, not for my country, but for my soul. The shame I had been carrying, the doubt that had been gnawing at my soul, it all came to a head on a day that felt heavier than any other. We were on a patrol, a special reconnaissance mission that took us deeper into the jungle than we had ever gone before. It was just my squad, a couple of ROK soldiers who were attached to our unit for this specific op, and a blanket of oppressive, suffocating silence. This wasn't the silence of peace. This was the silence of a predator, of a coiled snake. Every snap of a twig, every whisper of the humid wind through the leaves, felt like a thunderclap. The air was thick with the scent of decay and fear. We moved in single file, our bodies low, our eyes constantly scanning the dense foliage for any sign of movement, any sign of an ambush. It was different from our usual patrols. There was no casual chatter, no small jokes to break the tension. Even the ROK soldiers seemed more intense than usual, their faces carved from stone, their eyes sharper, more alert. The quiet was heavy, a physical weight on my shoulders. It pressed down on us and I felt like the jungle itself was watching, holding its breath. We had been warned that this area was a known Viet Cong stronghold, a place where they operated with impunity. But it wasn't the enemy I was worried about. The real enemy was the creeping dread in my gut, the sense that something was deeply, horribly wrong, and it had nothing to do with booby traps or ambushes. It was a feeling that had been building inside me ever since I'd first started to see the cracks in the facade of our allies. We had been walking for hours. My uniform was soaked through with sweat, my pack felt like it was filled with lead, and the constant buzz of insects was a maddening symphony. We came to a small clearing barely bigger than a living room, and that's when we heard it. Not a sound of combat. Not the snap of a twig or a distant gunshot. It was a faint, whimpering sound, a sound of raw human suffering. It was so out of place in the silent, deadly jungle that it made my blood run cold. It wasn't loud, just a quiet, choked-off cry. A cry that was instantly, cruelly silenced. My platoon leader, a guy named Jones, held up a fist. We all dropped to a knee, our rifles raised, scanning the tree line. The ROK soldiers didn't even flinch. They just moved forward, their movements fluid and silent, like they had expected this. My stomach clenched. This wasn't an ambush. This was something else. A kind of dread I hadn't felt since I first saw those cold, empty eyes. Jones gave a hand signal and we moved forward, our rifles still up. We followed the ROK soldiers, who moved with an eerie purpose, a certainty that they knew what they were walking into. The whimpering started again, a little louder this time, followed by a woman's cry, choked and desperate. And the sound of a baby, a tiny, terrified whimper. My blood went cold. We came to the edge of the clearing, hidden by a cluster of thick bushes. And that's when I saw it. The air felt like it was sucked out of my lungs. My rifle, which had felt like an extension of my arm for months, suddenly felt heavy and useless. Just a few feet away, in the middle of a small patch of sun-dappled earth, was a small, crudely built lean-to. And in front of it, one of the ROK soldiers, the one whose name I didn't even know, was on top of a young Vietnamese woman. She was on the ground, struggling, her eyes wide with terror. And in her arms, clutched to her chest, was a tiny baby maybe a year old. The baby was whimpering, its little face buried in its mother's chest. The scene was so out of place, so sickeningly wrong in the beautiful, lethal silence of the jungle. It wasn't a firefight, it wasn't a bombing, it was an act of pure, unadulterated evil. I was a soldier trained to kill the enemy, but I was not trained for this. This wasn't a military objective. This was something else entirely. My entire body went numb. My mind screamed, but no sound came out. The rage I had been suppressing, the shame I had been carrying, it all boiled up in a single horrifying instant. This wasn't an act of war. This was a complete and utter betrayal of everything I had ever believed in. And my mind went blank, all the training, all the rules, all the ideals, the world stopped. The jungle, with its oppressive heat and buzzing insects, vanished. All that existed was the sickening scene in front of me, the soldier, the woman, the baby. I wanted to scream, to rush forward and pull him off, to do something, anything, but my body felt locked in place. My mind was a whirlwind of noise and silence all at once. The training, the rules, the lessons about engagement and non-combatants, all of it came rushing back, colliding with the primal human instinct to stop a terrible wrong. The woman's eyes, they were fixed on me, begging for a rescue that I was too frozen to provide. I saw a tear, a single impossible tear, cut a trail through the dirt on her cheek. And in that moment, I wasn't a soldier anymore. I was just a human trying to hold on to the last shred of my humanity. A voice in my head, a voice that sounded like my father's, was screaming at me. Do something. Stop it. Now. But my training, years of it, was a vice around my actions. Do not engage an allied force. Do not compromise the mission. Do not cross the line. The ROK soldiers had not flinched. They were just watching. The one who was with my squad, a quiet, almost invisible guy, just stood there, his face as impassive as stone. He saw what I saw. He knew what was happening. And he was doing nothing. That quiet complicity I had felt before, it wasn't just a rumor anymore. It was real, standing right next to me, just as silent and terrifying as the act itself. I felt a surge of rage so pure it burned. Not just at the man on the ground, but at the entire damn system that had put me there to watch it. The ideals I had believed in, the noble cause I had signed up for, it all felt like a joke. A sick, twisted joke. This wasn't war. This was just evil. My hands started to shake. I could feel my fingers, cold and clumsy, fumbling with the safety on my rifle. I knew with a certainty that reached into my bones, that I would not let this happen. This was the line. The one I had been looking for, the one I had tried to ignore. This was where the gray had to become black and white again. I looked from the woman to the soldier. He looked up at me for a second, his eyes dead, his face showing no emotion. It was that look that sealed it for me. There was no humanity left in him, no plea for understanding, no sign of remorse. Just an empty, soulless stare. He was a machine. I was a human. And I had a decision to make. A single choice that would define who I was, not as a soldier but as a person. The rules said one thing. My soul screamed another. And for the first time in my life I chose my soul. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I lowered my rifle from the tree line and aimed. But not at the soldier's head. Not at his chest. In that moment of absolute clarity, the only thing I could think of was to stop him without killing him. I had to stop the act, but I wasn't going to become the same monster he was. I aimed low at the thigh where the bullet would take him down but not end his life. The metal felt cold against my finger. The world held its breath. The quiet whimper of the baby was the only sound I could hear. I don't know how long I hesitated. It felt like a lifetime. Every memory of home, of my mother's face, of my father's words about doing the right thing flashed through my mind. This was it. The moment of truth. And the truth was I had to be a man first before I could be a soldier. I took a deep breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed, impossibly loud in the silent jungle. It wasn't the sound of an ambush, it was a single violent crack that tore through the very fabric of everything. The ROK soldier on top of the woman screamed, not with rage but with a raw, guttural agony. He lurched to the side, clutching his thigh, the blood blooming dark and fast through his pant leg. He was down. He was off her. The woman, her eyes still wide with terror, scrambled away, pulling her baby with her. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at her attacker. She just looked for a way out, her body trembling uncontrollably. My platoon, just a few feet away, went silent. Their rifles, which had been raised and ready, lowered slowly. I could hear their confusion in the rustle of their gear, in the shocked silence. They didn't understand. They just saw me shoot an ally, a brother in arms. The ROK soldier on the ground was still screaming. My platoon leader, Jones, stared at me, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He was shouting something, but I couldn't hear him. The gunshot, it didn't just hit his leg. It hit the ideals I once believed in. It was a shot that shattered the last illusions about a just war, about a noble cause, about an unbreakable alliance. I had done the right thing, but in doing so, I had broken every rule. I was ready for the consequences. The ROK soldiers who were with us, they didn't look angry. They looked professional. One of them immediately moved to his fallen comrade, examining the wound, his face impassive. It was a sterile, dispassionate response. No fury, no questions. They were just assessing the damage. It was as if they knew that something like this was always a possibility. Knew that their own actions could get them shot. But my guys weren't like that. Jones finally got through to me, his face red with rage. What the hell was that, soldier? You just shot a goddamn ally. Are you out of your mind? I looked at him, and for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt a strange calm. He was raping that woman, sir, I said, my voice steady, my eyes fixed on his. He had her on the ground. She was holding her baby. Jones's face faltered for a second, a flicker of humanity crossing his features. But it was quickly replaced by a cold, hard anger. That's not your call. That's not your job. Our job is to fight the enemy, not each other. He was the enemy, sir, I said, and the words, once spoken, felt like the purest truth I had ever known. At that moment he was the only enemy I could see. He didn't have an answer for that. He just stared at me, his anger giving way to a grudging, resentful silence. It was in that moment that I knew that I had crossed a line, and that there was no going back. The woman, still trembling, managed to pull herself and her baby to her feet. She looked at me, and in her eyes I didn't see gratitude. I saw a bottomless, aching sadness. An emptiness that mirrored the one I was just beginning to feel inside myself. The horror of what she had just been through, it was etched on her face forever. That woman's eyes, they will haunt me forever. I stood there, alone in the clearing, my rifle still in my hands. The American soldiers were staring at me. The ROK soldiers were tending to their man. The baby was crying, a small, scared sound that was the only proof that humanity still existed in this ugly, godforsaken place. I was no longer a part of a platoon. I was no longer a part of a mission. I was just a man who had made a choice, and now I had to live with it. I had done the right thing. But the cost was everything. The silence that followed was 1,000 times louder than the shot itself. It wasn't the silence of the jungle. It was the silence of men who had just seen a line crossed that they didn't know existed. The ROK soldiers, with their cold, unnerving efficiency, worked on their comrade, tying a tourniquet, not saying a word. The screams of the wounded man were the only sound, a raw, animal noise of pain that cut through the air. My own platoon, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear, just stared at me. No one knew what to do. I had just committed an act that was unforgivable by military standards, and yet, in my own heart, it was the only thing I could have done. I didn't move. I just stood there, my rifle still up, aimed at the ground where the soldier had fallen. The woman with her baby had vanished back into the jungle, her silent flight more eloquent than any words. I knew I would never see her again, but her eyes, those eyes of terror and deep, profound sadness, they would be etched into my memory forever. They weren't just the eyes of a victim, they were the eyes of a witness. A witness to a crime and a witness to my act of defiance. The woman's eyes, they will haunt me forever. They are the cost of my action, the burden I've carried for 50 years. My platoon leader, Jones, finally made a move. He stepped towards me, his face grim. "All right, soldier," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Give me the rifle." I didn't hesitate. I unclipped it from my sling and handed it to him. I was ready for the brig. Ready for the courts-martial. I had no illusions. My military career was over. I had just shot a man and ally in a war zone. I wasn't just facing disciplinary action. I was facing a punishment that could put me away for a very long time. I had broken the chain of command, disobeyed a core principle, and turned on a man wearing the same uniform. It didn't matter what he had done. I was in a war, and in a war you don't shoot your own. Not for any reason. But I had to. And in doing so, I had finally found my purpose. I wasn't fighting for my country anymore. I was fighting for my soul. The two ROK soldiers carried their wounded comrade away. They said nothing to us. No threats, no accusations. Just a cold, silent retreat into the jungle from which they came. That silence was more terrifying than any verbal threat. It was a kind of professional understanding, a mutual acknowledgement that I had broken their code and they would remember it. My platoon leader, Jones, just shook his head, looking at me with a mix of fury and something I couldn't place, maybe a grudging respect. He ordered the rest of the squad to move out, leaving me there. He didn't lock me up. He didn't send me back to base with a guard. He just left me alone. It was an unspoken punishment, a kind of psychological torment that was far worse than any jail cell. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the silence pressing in on me from all sides. The mission was over. My purpose was complete. The soldier had been stopped. The woman and her child were free. But the moment of triumph, the relief I thought I would feel, it never came. Instead, I felt a deep, profound emptiness. A moral void. The ideals I had carried with me, the ones I had shot into that soldier's leg, they were gone. And nothing could replace them. This wasn't just a physical act. This was a psychic act. A breaking of a moral contract. I had stepped off the path I was supposed to be on, and now I was lost in a jungle of my own making, with nothing but the memory of a woman's terrified eyes and the sound of a single fateful gunshot to guide me. That shot was the beginning of my true war. A war not against the enemy but against myself. That night, after Jones and the rest of the squad left me behind, I found my way back to the base alone. My mind was a whirlwind of emotion, a mix of grim satisfaction and cold, paralyzing fear. I had done it. I had stopped him. I had done the only thing a man could do. But I had also broken every rule, and I was ready for the consequences. I expected to be arrested the moment I stepped onto the base. I expected to be cuffed, to be led away to a holding cell, to face the courts-martial I had earned with that single shot. I wasn't a fool. I knew what was coming. I reported to the command post. The commanding officer, a colonel I had only seen from a distance, just looked at me. No questions. No anger. Just a long, silent stare. I gave him a full, honest report. I told him what I had seen, what I had done, and why I had done it. I expected him to shout, to condemn me, to read me my rights. But he just listened. The silence in that room was more terrifying than the jungle itself. It wasn't a silence of respect. It was a silence of power. A silence that said he had heard all this before, that it was nothing new. He dismissed me and told me to report to the barracks. I waited. For a week I waited. Every time a jeep pulled up, every time a new order came down, I expected to see my name on a transfer list to the brig. But nothing came. Instead, I was given a new assignment. I was transferred to a remote supply unit, far away from any joint patrols, far from any ROK divisions. There were no charges. No official reprimand. No punishment. Just a quiet, unspoken transfer. It was the most chilling thing that could have happened. The lack of consequence was the consequence itself. They didn't need to tell me I was wrong. Their silence told me everything. It told me that they knew. The entire military machine knew about the special ops the ROK divisions ran. They knew about the atrocities, the brutality, the cold, ruthless efficiency. And they accepted it. It was part of the deal, part of the price of having such effective allies. My righteous anger, my moral stand, it was just an inconvenience to them. It was a fly buzzing in their perfectly oiled machine. Their silence was more painful than any wound. A court-martial, a sentence, that would have meant a moral reckoning. It would have meant that my act was a violation of a code that they actually believed in. But this was an admission that there was no code. That the rules I thought I was fighting for were just a formality. I had done the right thing, but I couldn't feel clean. My soul felt dirtier than ever. The moral injury that I had carried as a witness was now a permanent stain, a scar earned not from combat, but from the brutal silence of my own command. My own side had failed me, had failed to condemn evil when it was right in front of them. I finished my tour of duty in that supply unit, a ghost in my own army. I went home, and for 50 years I never spoke a word of it. How could I? How could I explain to my friends, to my family, that I had done a terrible, wonderful thing in a war where no one cared? How could I tell them that the biggest scars of war aren't on the skin but in the soul? They'd see the man who came home in one piece, with no medals for valor, and they'd think I was just lucky. But I wasn't lucky. I came home with a moral wound that festered for decades. I know now that my act was a small, almost insignificant rebellion. It didn't change the war. It didn't stop them. It didn't bring justice to a world that had forgotten what the word meant. But it saved me. It saved what was left of my soul. I did it not for the woman but for myself. So that I could look in the mirror and not see a bystander. So that I could find a single moment of moral truth in a war built on a mountain of lies. And that is a burden I'm still carrying, a story I'm still trying to tell. I shot a man, an ally, to save myself. And it's the only truth I have left. I came home to a country that didn't want to talk about the war. The physical scars were easy to hide, but the invisible ones, they followed me everywhere. The nightmares were the worst. Not of combat or explosions, but of the jungle clearing. The screams of that soldier, the terror in that woman's eyes. They were on a loop in my mind for years. My family, my friends, they tried to understand, but how could they? How could I explain that I was haunted not by the enemy I had faced, but by the ally I had shot? They saw a man who had returned from a war without a scratch, but they couldn't see the moral wound that was festering inside. The silence I experienced from my command, that chilling indifference, it followed me home. It taught me that sometimes, the institutions you trust, the ideals you believe in, are just a lie. They put me on a new path, a path of deep suspicion and distrust. I couldn't stand to see a man in a uniform of authority, whether it was a cop or a politician, because I knew what I knew. I knew what they were willing to look away from, what they were willing to let happen for a higher purpose. And I knew that higher purpose was a lie. The biggest scars of war aren't on the skin but in the soul. That is the truth I have lived with for 50 years. For decades, I wrestled with that moment in the jungle. I told myself I was a hero. That I had saved a life, protected the innocent. It was a story I told myself to get through the day. But it wasn't the full truth. The full truth is that the person I was then, the young man who thought he was doing the right thing, was still naive. He still believed in a justice system, even a military one. He still believed that his act would be judged, and that the man he shot would be punished. And that belief, that was my biggest mistake. If someone were to ask me now, after a lifetime of living with this, if I would do it again, my answer would be different. I wouldn't hesitate. I would do it again in a heartbeat. But I don't regret shooting him. I regret not shooting him in the head. Back then, I was trying to preserve a semblance of humanity, even for a monster. I was trying to uphold a rulebook that didn't matter. I was trying to save my own soul while still believing in a corrupt system. Now I know better. The only thing that mattered was stopping the evil permanently. The rulebook, the system, the ideals, they all failed. The only thing that was real was the evil in front of me, and the only thing that could stop it was a single, final, decisive act. The world is not a place for half measures. If someone asks me what war is, I will say it is the loss of humanity. Not just the enemy's but your own. You go into it thinking you are fighting for a noble cause, and you come out fighting just to get your soul back. You lose everything, your innocence, your trust, your belief in the system. And you come home with an invisible scar that tells you a different story than the one the history books tell. This is not a story about a hero. This is a story about a man who lost everything but his conscience. And that, in the end, is both my curse and my redemption.